It's time to separate fact from fiction when it comes to the separation of church and state. Welcome to Sharpening Arrows. I'm your host, Victor Jakes, and we are here to train teens to think biblically about life and politics. We are also on YouTube, youtube.com/at sharpening arrows, youtube.com/at sharpening arrows. My children may or may not make an appearance. You just never know. So if that amuses you, you can always watch the show instead of just listening. Thank you to all of the new listeners. I'm so grateful that you are joining us. And I want to just take a moment to talk about what is this show for? We talk about training teens to think biblically about life and politics, and we need to do that as parents. My son very recently just turned 13. I have two teenagers in the house. And what I need to teach them as a dad is that there are good arguments for bad ideas. Just because we know the truth, just because we teach our children the truth, doesn't mean we've prepared them to respond to the world and to what they will encounter in the popular culture. We need to be doing this continuously. We need to be helping our teenagers and our preteens understand the arguments they will encounter, understand what a worldview is. And that's why I encourage parents and teens to listen together. Think about, have it be a shared experience. We include in this show various pause points to actually literally stop the podcast. I know you're not supposed to do that as a podcast host, is tell your listeners to stop listening. But remember, this show is a tool to help you as a parent, to empower you as a parent, to train and prepare your child. And the best way to do that, the best way to train your mind for what popular culture will throw at you, is to understand the other side's best arguments. Not a caricature, not a straw man, but the absolute best version of those arguments. If you want to debate like Charlie Kirk or ask questions like Allie Beth Stuckey, you've got to know and understand the other side's arguments. And don't take my word for it. In a completely unintentional endorsement of Sharpening Arrows, Allie Beth Stuckey recently said this. This is a quote. "I'm always thinking about how I can hone my arguments better by thinking about what would someone say to this. And so I encourage you to do that with me." Yes, thank you, Allie. I 100% agree. Let's do this together. Now, the topic I want to cover is, should Christians, and then broaden it out a little bit to the church, be involved in politics? Now, if you're a longtime listener, you'll know one of my goals is to keep the podcast to 20 minutes. And you'll also know that very rarely do I pull that off. And so what I want to do with this topic of should Christians be involved in politics is actually split it into two discussions, because before we actually get to that question, there's an immediate objection that's going to be raised. And that's what I want to address in this episode. So here's our first pause point. Parents, this is a chance to stop the podcast and talk about this with your teenager. What comes to mind when you hear the phrase, the separation of church and state? Where did that phrase come from? Because if you even broach the subject of Christians or churches getting involved in politics, this is what you'll hear. This is being applied in court cases as we speak. This is from CBS News, talking about a ruling that came out on Tuesday. A federal judge issued a preliminary injunction on Tuesday requiring certain public school districts in Texas to remove 10 Commandments displays by December 1st. The districts would also be prohibited from posting new displays, according to the federal injunction. And this covers schools in Fort Worth, McKinney, Frisco, Northwest, Rockwell, and Mansfield. And this came about because in September, a group of Texas families represented by the American Civil Liberties Union, or ACLU, sued to stop school districts from displaying the 10 Commandments in classrooms, claiming it violates religious freedom and the separation of church and state. There's that phrase. The September suit came a month after a federal judge temporarily blocked the law in a separate case involving the Plano School District. That ruling found the law, quote, crosses the line from exposure to coercion, end quote, and favors Christianity over other faiths. So here's a pause point. Do you think there have ever been times when governments in the United States favored Christianity over other faiths? And I'm referring here specifically to times when the government would have favored Christianity over other faiths and there weren't objections to it. All right, so as we do on this podcast, we start with arguments for the side that I personally disagree with. In this case, we've got just one right here before us. The separation of church and state means religion and politics shouldn't mix. Take it from the Supreme Court. They're the ones who study the Constitution. They're the ones who know it best. In the 1947 Supreme Court case Jefferson versus Board of Education, Justice Hugo Black wrote, quote, "The First Amendment has erected a wall between church and state. That wall must be kept high and impregnable. We could not approve the slightest breach." Well, there it is. He's writing the opinion of the Supreme Court. There can't even be the slightest breach between this high wall between church and state. 15 years later, the court went further in a case called Engel versus Vitale. At issue in this case was the New York State Board of Regents encouraged school districts to begin each day with prayer. I want you to think about this. This is just 60 years ago, math's off. 60 years ago, the New York State Board of Regents put this prayer out, and it wanted students to say it in school. Almighty God, we acknowledge our dependence upon Thee. We beg Thine blessings upon us, our parents, our teachers, and our country. That's a very non-denominational prayer, and it was also voluntary. But a group of parents, including one Stephen Engel, said that the practice violated the Establishment Clause, and by a 6-1 margin, the Supreme Court agreed, and it struck down the prayer. Again, Justice Hugo Black, here he is again. He said that prayer was woefully inconsistent with the Establishment Clause. Further, he argued it is, quote, "no part of the business of government to compose official prayers for any group of the American people to recite as a part of a religious program carried on by government," end quote. Now, the court didn't buy the state's arguments that the prayer was harmless because it was denominationally neutral, and also students could choose to participate or not. Justice Black said that the Establishment Clause is violated by the simple fact of government sponsorship of religious activity. Now, this has gone so far that football coaches have gotten in trouble for praying with their teams after games. If you are speaking at a public high school graduation and you include a prayer in your speech, you can get in big trouble. Now, at the time, the public was very upset about the decision, but the court didn't budge and even went further, quickly banning school-sponsored Bible readings. Now, these cases have set the tone for decades. Even many Christians are leery of seeming too religious when it comes to politics, and churches that have more conservative members, well, very, very rarely do those churches even discuss issues that could be deemed political. All right, as we think about that, and before we get to responses, let me tell you about Mama Bear Prayers, a podcast for moms who are knee-deep in dishes and training their teens. Whether you are in the carpool lane or the coffee line, host Charity Rios wants to come alongside you and help you grow deeper in your relationship with Jesus. Now, as every parent knows, raising kids can feel a bit like a ping pong game. You bounce from moments of joy to moments of stress and worry. Combine this with the busyness of life, all those activities. This back and forth can leave you feeling overwhelmed and even isolated. As the mom of 4 very, very busy boys, Charity knows this firsthand, and it's why she created Mama Bear Prayers, to support moms who are on the journey of raising kids. God works through prayer, so check out Mama Bear Prayers today. All right, so let's dig into this idea that the separation of church and state means there can never be any mixing, a high wall between these two spheres? So let's have a pause point. Which of the great 8 questions would you use in response to these arguments? And for those of you who are new to the podcast, the great 8 questions are 8 questions that we put into our mental toolbox to help us examine issues. We don't just want to accept something that's told to us or said. We want to dig into it, and these questions help us do that. All right, question 1. What happens next? Question 2. Has this been tried before? Question 3. Is there a principle involved? Question 4. What are the trade-offs? Question 5. What do you mean by that? Question 6. Is this an appeal to emotion or logic? Question 7. Am I focused on the speaker or the argument? And question 8. What does the Bible say? Which of those questions would you use in response to this contention of the separation in church and state? And remember, there are lots of ways to go. Just because I choose one question and you chose another doesn't mean that you did something wrong. But the question that I would start with in responding to this is question 5. What do you mean by that? And this is really an encouragement to dig into this phrase, the separation of church and state. Let's have a pause point. Do you think the separation of church and state is found in the Constitution or the Declaration of Independence? I'm guessing that most people do because of how commonly it's used, because of the way the court cited it, but it's not. So when someone says the separation of church and state, let's press them on this and say, where is that coming from? Well, we know it's from a letter written by Thomas Jefferson to the Danbury Baptist in Connecticut. They were worried about their rights as a religious minority. And Jefferson wrote, Congress shall, quote, make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof. Now he's quoting the First Amendment there. Thus building a wall of separation between church and state. Okay, so while this phrase is not in the Constitution, and it should not be treated as it's in the Constitution, we can see that it does have a close connection with one of the founding fathers, and obviously a very important founding fathers, and that this idea that there is some separation between church and state. And I think most Christians would agree with that. We are not looking to have the church and state merge. We do not want the pastor to become the president. We do not want the president to become the pastor. But that leads us to our second point. Well, what does that mean? What does that look like? Obviously, Justice Black and many in the culture today means that there should be this complete separation. Did Jefferson think that? Did he think there should be a complete separation of the government and Christianity? Let's have a pause point. Do you think Jefferson would have objected to church services being held in the U.S. Capitol building? And this is kind of a twist on question 2. Has this been tried before? Because if someone is making a claim about what the Constitution means, well, then we can go back to the time of the founding. We can go back to Thomas Jefferson's actions and see if their interpretation squares with what Jefferson did. And if we go back to the time of the founding, we find that leaders at the time of the founding intermixed religion and government. And this is a quote from the Library of Congress. So I want you to understand, this is not some source that someone can dismiss and say, oh, that's just a crazy Christian conservative source. This is from the Library of Congress. It is no exaggeration to say that on Sundays in Washington during the administrations of Thomas Jefferson and of James Madison, the state became the church. Did you hear that? In the Jefferson administration, the man who wrote this letter saying that there's this wall of separation between church and state, the state became the church. Here's what that means. Within a year of his inauguration, Jefferson began attending church services in the House of Representatives. Madison followed Jefferson's example, although unlike Jefferson, who rode on horseback to church in the Capitol, Madison came in a coach and 4. Worship services in the House, a practice that continued until after the Civil War, were acceptable to Jefferson because they were non-discriminatory and voluntary. Boy, that sounds familiar. That sounds like the prayer that the Supreme Court said wasn't allowed because of this supposedly high and impregnable wall between church and state. And back to the Library of Congress. In attending church services on public property, Jefferson and Madison consciously and deliberately were offering symbolic support to religion. Okay, so what we can see from just this one example, just this one instance, is that Justice Hugo Black's interpretation of this phrase in Jefferson's letter doesn't fit with Jefferson's own actions. He has gone way too far. He's taken a phrase in a letter and he's twisted it into something that Thomas Jefferson would not have recognized, because Thomas Jefferson literally went to a government building and attended a church service there. Remember what Jackson or Hugo Black is claiming here. He is claiming that, let me find this, I'm sorry. We could not approve the slightest breach between this wall of separation between church and state. Well, Thomas Jefferson sure did. And in fact, he didn't just approve a breach. He had the wall so low that the church was meeting in the U.S. Capitol, and he attended it. What the founders knew is that while the government should impose a national religion, our government needed people to voluntarily adopt Judeo-Christian values. All right, let's go further. Look at point number 3 in response to this. At the time of the founding, states required religious tests to hold office. Again, this doesn't look anything like what Hugo Black is claiming when he says, oh, we can't approve even the slightest breach between separation between church and state. Now, if you've ever read the First Amendment, you'll notice there's something interesting. It says, Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof. It doesn't say, there shall be no laws respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof. Now, why was that? Well, because before we were a country, we were states. And if you dig into the state constitutions, what you will find is that many of them required people to be Bible-believing Christians to serve in the government. If they had said there can't be a law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof, the states would have looked at it and said, does that cover what's in my constitution right now? Now, in most of the states, required you to be a Protestant. Maryland, which was Catholic, didn't. Pennsylvania included this. Quote, I profess Lord and Jesus Christ as my Lord and Savior. That was in its state constitution. Charlie Kirk, after his tragic assassination, there was a clip of him explaining this that went viral. It's really a terrific clip, and he gives more details. But he also points out that 55 out of 56 of the original signers of the Declaration were Bible-believing, church-attending Christians. All right, fourth response here, this idea that there should be this high and impregnable wall between church and state. Well, the founders explicitly stated that our government was created for a Christian nation. This is George Washington in 1783. May have heard of him. May have been a foundational figure in the history of our country. This is what he said in 1783, and the English is a bit choppy to our modern ears. I now make it my earnest prayer that God would have the United States in his holy protection. Continuing on, that he would most graciously be pleased to dispose us all to do justice, to love mercy. Wow, those sound familiar. That's right from the Bible. And to demean ourselves with that charity, humility, and pacific temper of mind, which were the characteristics of the divine author of our blessed religion. And without the humble imitation of his example in these things, we can never hope to be a happy nation. So here's what Washington is saying. Unless we are imitating God, the God of the Bible, the God of Christianity, we can't hope to be a happy nation. It wasn't just him. John Adams, he was our second president. And when he was president in 1798, he wrote these words: "We have no government armed with power capable of contending with human passions unbridled by morality and religion. Avarice, ambition, revenge, or gallantry would break the strongest cords of our Constitution as a whale goes through a net. Our Constitution was made only for a moral and religious people. It is woefully inadequate to the government of any other." All right, let's have a pause point. Why is it so important? Why did Adams think it was so important for Americans to be a moral and religious people? This is really kind of a foundational thing, because we can look around the world. We can look at countries that are not Christian. We can look at governments that are explicitly atheist, and those governments function in one sense. Their country still exists. They haven't been invaded. At least in many of them, people are not dying of mass starvation. North Korea is a tragic exception there in terms of the starvation part, or any country that's gone too far along with socialism. But you can have a functional government without the government or the people being Christians. But what Adams is saying here is that our government, the government that they established, the government that's in the Constitution, the limited government, we could have a limited government because what was going to constrain people first was Christianity, was their moral beliefs. So we didn't need a government to be everywhere to do everything, because first and foremost, people would be constrained by their beliefs about God and morality. All right, next time. See, I blew right past 20 minutes. And if I had done the second half of this episode, I would have been pushing 45. So next time, we're going to look at why Christians should be involved in politics. And just a programming note, this episode is probably not going to come out until early next week. I help run a homeschool speech group out here in Las Vegas, and we're having a tournament this Saturday, which I'm very excited about. But it is taking up quite a bit of my time. So if I don't get another episode out, we're going to answer this question next week: why Christians should be involved in politics. All right, if you enjoyed this podcast, please subscribe on YouTube or share it with a friend that has a teenager or a preteen. Let's help sharpen those arrows together. Be courageous like Charlie, stay sharp, and give God the glory. I'll see you next time.